we debate a panel on the new EU enlargement. New candidate countries, new challenges, new reasons like we've never seen it before as far as these countries are concerned, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova. Now, how will these countries benefit from their new candidate status, and how will the EU27 benefit from this candidate status of these countries? I will be presenting my guests today, and I would ask you to applaud then after this. We have Maka Botchorishvili, Chair of the EU Integration Committee of the Parliament of Georgia, Simona Cojocaru, State Secretary for Security Policy and International Relations in Romania, Lukas Mandl, he's a member of the European Parliament of the EVP, Vasyl Khymynets, Ukrainian ambassador here in Austria, then Franziska Davies, historian from the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, Katarina Matanova, Deputy Director General from the Directorate General for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, the European Commission in Brussels, Rudolf Striedinger, Chief of Staff of the Austrian Armed Forces. And we have a remote participant, Vytautas Landsbergis from Lithuania. He was the head of government of Lithuania after the country achieved independence in 1999. I think the video connection is working.
Hello.
In der ersten Diskussion.
Now we're going to start with our first round of discussions. Now we're all following the media every single day, and we're all hearing the news. We're hearing on what's going on in Ukraine with a view to the Russian aggression. Now, I would like to talk about the latest developments, and then during our second round we will be talking about EU enlargement. And I would also like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions after we've had our panel discussion. Now, Ms. Botchorishvili, we have seen that Russia has mobilized, and many Russian people have come to Georgia. And how are people in Georgia dealing with this situation? Could you maybe talk about that?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here today and to take part in these discussions and in this forum, which is very important and very good agenda, very important topics. Since Russian aggression started in Ukraine 24th of February this year, Europe, many things has changed in Europe, and we face aggression which Georgia has experienced for decades. And we are the country which has been occupied by Russia, and we have experienced that aggression for a long time in different forms. And the latest was 2008 invasion of Georgia, which unfortunately did not serve as a wake-up call for Europe to see what was cooking in there and what we were facing, which actually ended up with occupation of 20% of Georgian territories. And since then, it is our daily life. Daily life is Russian troops in Georgia, military presence. Daily life is a violation of human rights on the occupied territories, kidnapping of Georgians from the occupation line, and yes, difficult dividing lines, dividing families, dividing yards, and you know, creating very difficult humanitarian situation on the ground. That is what we are facing every day since, well, decades, and 2008 especially. After aggression started in Ukraine, we have different optics to Russia. We have different understanding of aggression, and yes, it's pleasant to see that Europe is united and European Union stands very strong and to respond this aggression today. This response, I think what is happening and what we are facing now is very much important, and it is much more than protecting and protection of sovereignty of Ukraine or Georgia. I think it is something similar if we take a scale of events, what is happening, what happened in the 90s when Soviet Union collapsed. And what we are facing now, we are facing this kind of geopolitical shift, I would say. That's why it is very important what will be the response from European Union. That's why it was very important to have clear messages and clear messages for these countries where our future is, because since our independence we are striving for European integration. We are striving for membership to the European Union and transatlantic integration. That is strategic goal of the country, and for decades we are moving to that direction. And I think very important was 2014 when we signed the association agreement with the European Union, and that was actually a very clear decision from Georgia that that is our way, that is our future, that's where we are going, and or dedication to implementation of the association agreement. And visa-free travel with European Union, that was another achievement. And I think Georgia has proved many times that we are part of Western civilization. We have been in Afghanistan together with NATO. We are in Central Africa with the European Union. And I think that is very important what Georgia does in that direction to be part of Europe or Western world, I would say. And today it is very important to have clear understanding how vulnerable Georgia is in this situation when we are facing another aggression against Ukraine in our region, and how vulnerable situation is in Georgia. While we don't have, we are not members of NATO, we are not members of the European Union, so we are missing two main security guarantees, which is security, hard security, and then economic insurance of economic umbrella as EU member states have. So in that sense, we are still trying to secure our security, first of all, on first place. When you have military presence from Russia just a couple of meters away from the main highway of the country, it definitely creates additional threats. And of course, with this situation, we are trying first to secure our country, not to have another military aggression in Georgia, and to ensure stable development of country, which is basic and very important for our future, for achieving our strategic goals, which are integration into the European Union and integration into the NATO. So.
Frau Cojocaru,
Ms. Cojocaru, Ms. Botchorishvili just said it. EU support for Ukraine and also for Georgia, for example. But many citizens in the EU have their own problems to deal with. The next energy bill, inflation. Do you think that people are now less willing to support Ukraine?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really very happy to be here in Salzburg for the first time with such a distinguished panelist and such a great audience. Thank you for the question, and I would like to start by saying that indeed, ladies and gentlemen, in Europe we are witnessing a watershed moment And I think our leaders, our populations, are very much aware about the implications of having a war of aggression in Europe at our borders. Romania, a country with the longest frontier with Ukraine, 650 kilometers, it's very close to this war, brutal war of aggression. We are very close also to the Black Sea, which is today a very strategic center for EU and also for NATO. In relation with what is happening right now in Ukraine, as I said, unprovoked, brutal, illegal war of aggression led by Russian Federation, I'm always saying, what is old is again new. And we, the countries in the East, in Central and Eastern Europe, are feeling, we are perceiving more acutely, if you like, this war. Because, you know, the history is repeating. And we have to be all prepared for all these challenges that you have also mentioned, because what is happening in Ukraine is very much multidimensional. We are having in Ukraine military, classical, conventional war, we have a hybrid war, we have a refugee crisis, we have a food crisis with the grain exports, we have also an energy crisis. And we have to be prepared. And I have to say here that the government of Romania was very much aware about all these implications, you know, in a way triggering the support of our own populations. And I recall the first images of the Ukrainian refugees crossing the border somewhere in the north of the country, women and children. And I have seen people coming from capital city, from Bucharest, traveling 600 kilometers to the border just to help. And I think this is about a huge, huge mobilization of the civil society together with the government in front of the biggest security crisis in Europe since the end of the World War II. Moreover, I'd like to say here that apart from our shared values, we stood united in Europe. And I think this is the greatest lesson that we learned together these 8 months, that we need to be united, and to act in solidarity. And I think that at the end of the day, scale, scope, and speed of our reaction surprised even the President Putin. Moreover, 2.5 million Ukrainians crossed the border in Romania, like in other countries, like in Poland, like in Slovakia, and in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And we helped a lot, because it's such a comprehensive endeavor. It's not only related with crossing the border, it's about trauma, it's about education of young children, it's about hosting these families that are in desperation, coming and being refugees in other countries. Moreover, apart from these facts, 60% of the Ukrainian cereals, grains were transported via Romania, about 4 million tons, which is a lot. So, in a nutshell, I would like to say that we did a lot, we stay determined to continue to help, because the brave Ukrainian people, its armed forces, needs our support very, very much.
Also viele durchaus auch als Versprechen.
Yeah, this is certainly something that we can also see as a promise to the ambassador. Almost 8 months have gone by since the 24th of February. For almost 8 months, the Ukraine has been fighting Russian forces. Could you maybe talk about the current situation? What are the information you're getting from Kiev? We're hearing a lot in the news. Ukrainian infrastructure is attacked in a very targeted manner. The Ukrainian foreign minister has recently warned that a tsunami of refugees will stream into Europe. This is provoked by Russia, according to the foreign minister. What are the current informations you're receiving?
Guten Tag. Ich möchte mich.
Hello. Thank you very much. for inviting me to this event. Thank you very much, Dr. Schausberger. And the question we're discussing now really relates directly to Ukraine and to the people in Ukraine, but we're also talking about Europe in general. Now, to answer your question, let me say the following. Whenever we talk about the situation, we have to look at two different dimensions. We have to look at what is happening at the front line, and then we also have to look at how Russia is acting in a brutal manner, launching missiles, using all military means against a civil population and against the civil infrastructure as well. Let me just briefly talk about the front line from a military perspective. We have been showing that we are actually capable of liberating our country completely. We are able to ensure our sovereignty and to protect our territory in accordance with internationally recognized borders. This is important. And then there's a different dimension to the whole scenario. The terrible attacks with missiles and drones targeted to the civil population. These are very painful attacks. But, as you will know, the people in Ukraine are very strong. And I can assure you, we will not break. The Russian aggressor will not take us down. And we want the people in Europe to see this. The European community and the European society should also not be broken on a psychological level. And as you've said quite correctly when you ask your question, we have to think about what Putin aims at. Well, Putin wants to attack Europe. It's a war Russia is leading to bring down the free European order. Now, for decades, Putin has tried to sow discord in Europe and try to weaken Europe, and he's continuing to do that by launching attacks. Let's just look at the refugee situation. The idea is to cause a migration crisis, a migratory crisis. Also by making it impossible to export grain from Ukraine. And the Russians have been stating this very clearly. This is certainly a danger we're facing. Ukraine has really showed a very strong will. Now, this decision was very important for us, but we also have to look at the broader context. The decision to install the grain corridors, it wasn't an easy one to take for us. And if you just look at the wider context, the entire situation, all the challenges, Putin wanted to weaken Europe by causing an energy crisis, and Ukraine reacted immediately. We were willing to sell our energy. This is the contribution we made. Now, attacks are being launched on our civil infrastructure, and Putin is launching these attacks in order to make sure Europe is not experiencing full energy security. Now, let's look at things from a different angle. A new wave of people from Ukraine seeking protection. And winter is approaching. And if our infrastructure continues to be attacked, then people will face a lack of energy and water during the winter. Now, the question we're discussing here is a very complex one, and it relates to our common interests. Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will continue to do that. But then the war is not just a war in Ukraine. Putin is threatening Europe. Putin is a threat to European values and to the security in Europe. And Ukraine is a nation that is impacted in a very specific way. And I'm really proud to be talking to you today as a Ukrainian. We are a strong nation. We will never break. But what counts is that we will get support, significant support from our European partners also in the future. It is important for people in Ukraine to get support straight away, to make sure that people can remain in Ukraine. We need energy, aggregates, we need support and aid. And then again, Europe, the European Union, needs to continue to increase its political pressure on Russia. Russia must be further weakened. Russia, Putin's regime, has to understand that it cannot go on leading this war. And this is my call upon Europe and the society in Europe. We are strong. Together we are strong. Europe is strong. We have seen solidarity, and we have seen how the EU has been acting together. And until recently, maybe this is something that hasn't been as visible as it is now. Now, solidarity and working together will continue to be important. And if we continue to work together, then Putin doesn't stand a chance. Now, you're saying to increase the pressure on Russia. Those countries that are have been a part of the EU27 for years, for decades, and many countries in Europe have been advocating for a stricter stance towards Russia, and I'm going to talk to Ms. Landsbergis.
First of all, happy belated happy birthday. A few days ago you celebrated your 90th birthday. Den 90. Geburtstag hat Herr Landsbergis vor einigen Tagen.
A few days ago, Mr. Landsbergis celebrated his 90th birthday.
That passed already.
Wir haben hier ein paar
I'm free from that trouble.
Mr. Landsbergis, the Baltic states, respectively Lithuania, urged EU countries for years to take a stronger position on Russia and against Russia. The Baltic states always warned to be too naive. So, do you feel heard right now?
Correct. And not only you, but very often and very many of political thinkers. We are not against Russia. We are pro-liberty, pro-freedom, pro-rights of all nations to decide about themselves. Freedom of choice. That was our goal, strive, and for what we are struggling. If Russia was against freedom, then naturally, of course, we appeared against such a position, but not against Russia if it would like to be different, not imperialist, not aggressive, and not in a constant war with neighbors. That is a misfortune. For Russia itself, and especially for smaller neighbors. So the key of many political problems in Europe, especially that Central Eastern one, bordering with anti-European Russia, is fundamental difference. The key is fundamental difference between understandings. What is the sense and goal of existence of national states and their communities, cooperating and peaceful states? Russia is different, unfortunately. Russia is not cooperating. Russia is aggressive, striving for imperial governance over neighbors. That is the great problem, not for Europe only. It may become a problem to live or not to live for entire Europe and even the world.
When in Brussels,
Yes.
When in Brussels, the Lithuanian government always asked for tighter sanctions. Do you understand that, for example, the Austrian government would not accept, for example, a gas embargo, an embargo on Russian gas?
As for Austrian government, it would be a separate talk and discussion, and please ask Austrian government about what they wish, how they see the situation and problems in Europe, especially those are related with Russian imperialism. Until it is not finished and not out of business, we always will have the problems, even the threat of existence. We see what current Russia led, governed by Putinism, turning the quite entire nation of Russian people into quasi-insane people, fascist type people, calling Heil Putin, Heil Hitler. It's very similar. And that is indeed dangerous for all structure of post-war, as called post-war. We are in a constant war, and maybe pre-war times. Pre-war period, if this war will come between big powers, Russia of Vladimir Putin and his plan against democracies in Europe and in the West, entirely against all Western civilization, which wish to be democracy, which wish to be cooperative, not dictating, and striving for telling and building a truth and truth-toward society of nations, not under dictatorship of any empire, which is even not worth to rule, being entity of very low quality in human sense.
Mr. Landsbergis, one last question. When in Brussels, we know that EU countries support Ukraine with weapons, with money. Should EU countries also ask for a saying when talking about negotiations or a truce fire, for example?
It is quite strange to listen again about negotiations. What is a negotiation? About what is going on? With whom? Who and with whom should negotiate? The attacker killer with his victim. Of course, the victim would like to be free from that danger and sufferings, but it is not a goal of that attacker and abuser. He does not want to negotiate, maybe to negotiate on his own conditions, to get the result, in part by means of war, and also terror and psychological terror, pressure, intimidation, and all other very bad things and methods of action out of normal cooperation. What we want, and I'm sure that many or all the European nations do want, to have a cooperating environment and family of European nations. Russia, as it is today, is out of Europe by political culture, by culture of cooperation and building the future better for the people. Russia is trying to build their own future oriented on governance and getting more and more lands. In some senses, those lands maybe are seen as a formally governed by Russia, and that the unfinished revenge is paralyzing the Russia itself. They claim that being not at such a terrible empire as before is very bad for them. For whom? For emperors? Maybe for emperor, but emperor is not the most wise person which can establish the rules for environment, especially in such environment as an entity of European democracies with their own experiences and centuries-long building of democracy tradition. Russia for them is barbarous danger.
Clear words by Mr. Vytautas Landsbergis. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you very much. Herr Mandl, wir haben darüber gesprochen, die Ukraine erhält sehr viele Waffenlieferungen.
Mr. Mandl, we were just saying that Ukraine is receiving many arms from EU countries, and a military training has now also been authorized, but not everyone is going to take part in it. A lot is being said about neutrality. You have come out in favor of a participation of Austria, but you haven't been able to convince the Austrian government of this. Well, I can say that the land defense of Ukraine with land weapons should be possible, and it could be done on the basis of the European Peace Facility, which is what was decided at the time when it was set up, of course, in the hope that it would never be necessary. But now we need it. And I can only agree with the ambassador who says that this is the war of Putin against the free world. This is the Putin-Russia war against the free world. And it's being carried out with conventional arms in Ukraine, but with hybrid means in the whole world, especially gegen Europe, because disinformation and so forth has already been mentioned today. So that is just one dimension. Not only we, but also the United States of America are contributed to land defense. And since I became politically active, I have to say that time and again, the European commitment was that Europe will be able to help itself in times of conflict, but not the way it was during the Balkan Wars, where the United States had to intervene, terrible wars in which many war crimes were committed again. And now the same thing is happening, and we must say this. If we're going to be truthful, we have to be frank and admit it, that the United States are supporting us again here today. But we are participating in sanctions. This is one of the first ways of defending ourselves against a bloody attack with non-bloody means, and we now have to prepare for the waves of migration which are being triggered by the hybrid means of war which are being used. And this has already been mentioned that Putin's Russia is intentionally making sure that this is going to happen in order to damage Europe. Of course, the Austrian government is actually doing quite a bit, also in the field of training. The European Federal Military Service was very much participating in the mission in Mali, from which the EU has now withdrawn. And interestingly enough, just prior to Putin's war in Ukraine and now in Mali, the terrain has been left to Putin, and probably a couple of days later that decision was would not have been made. And let me just point out that the Austrian troops stayed in Mali. They're doing very well. They're well trained, and they receive much recognition, and therefore I can only say that it should be recommended that the Austrian military also participate in training measures for Ukrainian soldiers. And if it's not even if it hasn't been decided yet today, we think that it could be done in the future. Well, did you speak to the defense minister of Austria about this? Well, I have been consulted not only on this issue, but on many others in this connection in order to preserve our Austrian security, which is also important. And of course, that is very much linked to the security of the free world. And therefore, I am in constant contact, not only with the defense minister, but with many others. But I'm not doing this. What I'm saying today is not something that I'm saying in order to provoke anyone. And it's not as if the Austrian military has to lead the training measures as we did in Mali, but we could have a very dynamic contribution that we could make. And therefore, I think that our trainers, our instructors in the Austrian Federal Army are the ones who should be talking about this, and not just me. But in any case, it's always giving and taking when you're living together in the free world as we do, and we should be helping each other. Well, neutrality is used, I won't say as an excuse, but it's often referred to, and that this is the reason that we couldn't take part. But you're saying that it's different? Well, I would say that neutrality is a very important political instrument which we use in a positive way, and we do it often. And in this case, it would be part of preserving that neutrality that we would want to continue to participate in EU military missions, especially when it's about training. And in this very important case, above all, you said something about Austrian security. Mr. General Schillinger, infrastructure is being attacked even by Russian drones that got as far as Zagreb. Could you perhaps tell us, without starting to sound alarmist, but how quickly could Austrian infrastructures be hit? Well, thank you, first of all, for your invitation. Before I start answering a question, let me just answer something to what our Austrian MEP just said, let me just say that I'll be going to Brussels tomorrow to say something about that training mission, and I'll be talking to the general staff there. We have said that we will examine the measure and then decide to what extent Austria can, in practice, take part in this mission. And that is a process which is ongoing, as we know, and therefore the last word is as clear as you just said. Or rather, that is the case at the moment, but it's not as if things couldn't develop, and we can definitely still think about taking part after having examined the measure very carefully. And the example from Mali was very telling in that respect. Now, as to infrastructure in Austria, at the moment we're on a very secure and good level, but we have seen that the conflict and the unjustified war led by Putin has already had repercussions in Europe, and that there are measures which have been directed against infrastructure. And even if it's not always easy to find out who actually carried out the attacks, but they certainly always have the goal of weakening infrastructure in Europe. So what do you mean exactly? I mean, Nord Stream 1 and 2, the German bank, and so forth. These are attacks where we're not sure where they actually came from. And this is all a part of hybrid warfare on the part of Russia. So it's not a war, well, formally, yes, it's a war between Russia and Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's also a war of Russia against the European value system. And this is why we are so glad that Ukraine is fighting back so strongly and is not giving up. And therefore, they certainly earn the support of Europe and the whole free world. And that is why I am so glad, and I hope this will remain the case, that the EU countries are standing together in their support of Ukraine, because now the winter is coming and energy prices have gone up drastically, and we can already see that an erosion, if I can call it that, might be possible with respect to this support, and therefore our politicians have to remain dedicated to supporting Ukraine, in my opinion. Now, with respect to critical infrastructure in Austria, we are still on the safe side at the moment, but we are intensively looking into this issue at the moment because we don't want to be surprised. Then a question which I imagine people ask you all the time. Many were surprised that the Ukrainian army has been able to defend itself for so long, of course with the support of others. But how can it be that the Russian army is apparently in such bad shape? Well, Putin thought that he would be through in 3 days. And the political leadership in Ukraine would fall, and that then he could keep on following his plan. That's probably what he was expecting, but exactly the opposite came to pass. And the troops on all levels in Russia were apparently not ready to move into warfare. And that begins with the motivation of individual soldiers and goes all the way into complicated military concepts and strategies where apparently much was done wrong consistently. And therefore, at the beginning, there was only failure. And then later on, this consolidation on the east and the south first led to success. But now, in the meantime, the massive support from the West has made it possible for the Ukrainian military to achieve a failure on the Russian side again. and the partial mobilization in Russia, which was announced, was a result of this. But they're only partially successful, and you have to make a distinction there. Of course, we have a federal army which can be mobilized, but it's a bit different because our soldiers would have to be basically trained again, because and that, however, is something which is not provided for in Russia, and therefore it would take months to be able to achieve an effect there. And if Ukraine succeeds in winning back enough territory first, then perhaps the opposition could fall altogether. Ms. Davies, sorry, as a historian, it seems that everyone agrees that Russia provoked the war. But if you look into social networks and elsewhere, it is not that clear. Often NATO is made responsible, the Americans are made responsible, and you can read that the Americans want to push the Europeans into a proxy war. And these are things that we often hear when talking to people in our societies. It's the Americans' fault and NATO's fault and so forth. Well, let me just say thank you for this invitation as well. And I'm very pleased and honored to be on this high-level panel. But I'd like to say, and this, of course, goes hand in hand with what you just said, Mr. General, I am not an expert on Russian military matters, but I do know something, a thing or two about colonialism and history. And one reason why Putin made a bit of a mistake was that dictators have trouble communicating. And that may have been the case for Putin as well, that his military conveyed to him a picture of his arming that did not correspond to reality. And of course, yes, this is a war against the European security order, and it's a war against the democratic order, which was being consolidated more and more in Ukraine, but it is also a neo-imperialist war against Ukraine and against Georgia at some point, and Moldova, and Europe in the end, and it's Putin's imperialist obsession, and he believes what he says about Ukraine, that they are a minor people, that they actually don't even exist, and that they're part, on the one hand, part of Russia, on the other hand, that they have to be destroyed, and that they could not set up a state. And he thought that Ukraine would not put up any resistance. And since you asked this question, of course, we agree here on this panel, but if you listen to discussions in Germany and in Austria, it is similar. And if you look at what politicians too were saying before the 24th of February, there were many things that were said at that time by politicians which were similar to what you're talking about there. And it just wasn't impossible to imagine this kind of security mechanism with respect to Russia. But here, of course, this was about someone who simply does not accept this kind of security order. And it would have, what would have been necessary was to avoid this neoliberalist aggression. And of course, we might have been able to avoid it, but Chechnya, we looked away, Syria, we looked away and never did anything. And this war did not start on the 24th of February, I'm sorry. It began in 2014. So if we're now talking about the war having begun, now that is wrong. All this was the total invasion, the total aggression, and the total escalation. That's what it was. But the war began in 2014. And why has this narrative been conveyed that it's about NATO, that it's about East gegen West and so forth? That has to do with the fact that we in Western Europe, above all, the Poles didn't have that problem, and the Baltic states didn't have it either because and of course, Georgia didn't have it either because they have a similar historical background as Ukraine. we had a colonial perspective on Ukraine, which has improved since the 24th of February, but it's still there. And that is why we have these narratives still out there. And it has to do with the fact that there is a very long tradition of Soviet-Russian aggression against Ukrainian independence. And then this colonial myth that the Ukrainians and the Russians are one nation, one people, which was born, and this was born in the 19th century in the Russian Empire and was carried forward up into modern times. But it's a myth. And probably it was also carried forward so easily because during the Soviet Union, Russification of Ukraine worked out so well, or at least well for Russia. And really, as a historian, my hair stands on end when I hear people saying, well, they all speak Russian anyway in Ukraine. That is a myth. It is wrong. And these are things that we should have approached critically long ago, not just this year. And of course, since we had our own Western tradition as our background, it was easy for these myths to survive. So it's important to see how we describe this war. It's a war against democracy. That's clear. But it's also a war that began in 2014 with the Orange Revolution, because there it was becoming clear that here an Eastern European country is becoming a democracy. And it was not a coincidence that the aggression against Ukraine that took place in 2014, when in Maidan it was clear that things were not going to be reversible anymore. And then often, well, I don't like the word we. When we say we took Ukraine up in the West, we made them do this and that. That is a colonial discourse. I'm sorry. The Ukrainians didn't need anyone. They didn't need us to tell them that democracy and in freedom with the rule of law is more attractive than to live under a regime like the Yanukovych regime, which was corrupt, and which even for Ukrainian circumstances was downright corrupt and stealing people's money. People didn't need us to tell them that that wasn't a good thing. And of course, they ended up in a revolt against this. And when in Maidan Square that camp of young people was dispelled violently, people started looking and started asking questions. And the people there, however, were not saying that it was because of NATO. It was because our children were being mishandled. And since we don't know enough about what has internally happened in Ukraine, we developed these myths. And these Russian imperialist traditions were easily carried forward even in our point of view. So let me just say once again, it is a total invasion. It began in 2014, and it's a genocidal war which wishes to exterminate Ukraine. And you can see that in what Putin is saying. He didn't start saying it in February. There's that pseudo-historical essay which he published in 2021 about Ukraine and the Russian background and so forth. And that is the background of excuses that are being used in order to try to Russify Ukraine, because Ukraine, he says, was only an artificial creation of the Bolsheviks. And if you see what he's doing now in those regions, going after the elites, deporting Ukrainian children to Russia, if you look at that and look and put it side by side with the UN's definition of genocide, which was made in 1929, then as a historian, I would say this is a genocidal war. I'm sorry. And Europe is a post-genocidal society. We had the genocidal war against the Bosniaks, And we had World War II, which was started by Germany in Eastern Europe, and that was also genocidal war. And now, therefore, we have an enormous responsibility to make sure that this is not repeated. And it's already repeating itself, but we must not accept that is perpetuated.
Mehrmals das Jahr 2000.
Repeatedly 2014 was mentioned, the Maidan as well, and repeatedly we hear the accusation that there is a slowish reaction, a soft reaction of the EU. Would the EU have had to act a bit more fiercely in 2014 already?
Well, if we... Sorry, I need to take this off. Well, if we want to live in a liberal democracy, then yes is the answer. But first, let me thank you for inviting me. It's my second appearance in Austria in the last 3 months. I was at the Alpbach Forum, and all I can say that it's extremely useful to have historians on the panel. Madam Davies, I was with Timothy Snyder on a panel in Alpbach, and I cannot agree more. This is a colonial war, and I very much hope that this panel will actually contribute to the Austrian political discourse, that we will not be talking about, or we may agree that Russia provoked this war. It's not a provocation of a war. There are not two belligerents. When I hear two belligerents, it's like a spider crawling up my arm. It's an invasion, and it's indeed an invasion and a war where there are war crimes committed on a daily basis. Putin cannot win on the battlefield, thanks to the brave Ukrainians and the Western support in arms. So he's attacking civilians. He is destroying civilian architecture. He's destroying hospitals, maternity wards, schools. I went a month ago to Kiev. We were driven around, Bucha, Gostomel, Irpin, and a couple other towns. Schools were destroyed. Children playgrounds were destroyed. I have traumatized colleagues telling me, who are now in Brussels, that on Taras Shevchenko Street in Kiev, the playground that they took their kids is now destroyed. So this is a war where war crimes are committed on a daily basis. And I'm from a neighboring country. I'm from one of the countries that President von der Leyen in her State of the Union address in the European Parliament said that we should have listened to the Easterners. Yes, you should have listened to the Easterners. I'm from Slovakia. So I will take the liberty to say, Austria lives under the security umbrella of NATO, okay? You are in the middle of the NATO, so this is your security umbrella. Perhaps time to have a dialogue and discourse that Sweden and Finland had. Maybe it's time to change. That's not up for me to say. But what is for me to say is Syria was mentioned, Aleppo, the same tactics. Georgia was mentioned in 2008. In 2007, apart from the speech by Putin at the Munich Security Forum, the very belligerent speech, was the first attack, which was the hybrid attack on Estonian entire e-government infrastructure. So there are many steps when the Russland Verstehe could have said, okay, well, we see that this is not a friendly country, it's not a friendly regime, and it's a regime that is presiding over a declining economy apart from fossil fuels. There's nothing that they manufacture. It's based on raw materials and declining society with low birth rates and life expectancy much lower than in the West. So the only way for Russia to feel strong is for the others to be weaker and put the others to their knees. And they either do it by capturing 24% of this lady's country is occupied by Russia, 24% of the territory. It's not 1, 2, 3%, 24% of the territory. And this is something that we need to really look at the situation now. Not that we are helping Ukrainians, we are helping ourselves. I mean, this country has an immense capacity for solidarity and for welcome. It was in '56, it was the Hungarians. In '68, it was, you know, my parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts. After the Balkan Wars, people were coming here. But now it's not about helping Ukrainians because we need help Ukraine. We need to help ourselves because this is indeed an aggressive regime that is not based on the same values.
And do you think that the, as you mentioned, Russland verstehe understand it right now?
No, well, if I would have thought that the notion that Russia provoked, that it was the US or NATO provoking the war would be really a fringe issue that even wouldn't be mentioned on a panel like this. The fact that you mentioned it and you're a reporter for ORF in Brussels makes me realize that perhaps not everybody understands it yet, that this is about us. And honestly, I realize there is a huge inflation. I realize that the prices are big, and it's easy for me to say because I earn a good salary and there are people who are really struggling. But for most Europeans, it's going to be about whether I put a thicker sweater on ourselves. Yes, some companies may struggle, but there are massive government support schemes, etc. In Ukraine, you're paying with your own life and your life of the children. So, you know, coming from the country I come from, and this is a line that I am taking from the Romanian Minister of Foreign Affairs. I heard him say that in Prague, that the one thing that we can bring to the table is our experience in capacity to sacrifice. You know, when we went through the transition reforms, we really sacrificed. We learned how to sacrifice. Prime Minister Landsbergis would know a lot about that. And so let's look at this winter. Yes, we are going to have a tough winter. Yes, we may need to not be as comfortable as we are used to, but it's nothing in comparison to the sacrifice that the Ukrainians are making, not only to save their life and their territory and their freedom, but ours as well.
Wenn wir über die EU
When speaking concretely,
EU enlargement. So EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen suggested to grant Ukraine the candidate status. However, Ukraine for years, for dozens of years, was knocking on the door of the European Union. However, there were always like arguments, there were reports about corruption in Ukraine that would not allow Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. However, in the beginning of, before summer, Ukraine was granted the candidate status. Does this mean that the EU also does not really follow its own rules right now due to the war?
Okay. So, one of the most powerful, and powerful for a decade, plus than a decade, Russian narrative that is so domesticated across Europe, your country, my country, Brussels, everywhere, is, oh, Ukraine is so corrupt, it's practically a failed state.
There were reports about the European Court of Auditors.
Yeah, believe me, I spent probably 2 weeks straight on that European Court of Auditors report, which they, anyway, I'm not going to comment on it now, but there is no question that there is corruption in Ukraine, as there is corruption in most countries I know, certainly including my own, certainly including the one I live in, and many others. There are countries that at a comparable level of development which are not defined by corruption. And when I hear that they are one of the most corrupt countries in the world, I have again spiders crawling up my arm. It's a Russian narrative that is spread So, because if it was such a failed state, as the Russian narrative goes, they would have fallen like a house of cards. Why didn't you asked the general the question that everybody was surprised? Well, not everybody was surprised. Timothy Snyder was not surprised. I was not surprised about the Ukrainians holding up and a few others. But Ukraine before the war was not known at all. The Sovietologists became Russologists. The German attention to the Soviet Union was 100% transferred to Russia. And Ukraine was not a known country. We are discovering, right? In the collective psyche, I think you mentioned similar issue. We are discovering Ukraine. And we are discovering that they are actually like us. They actually value freedom. They actually value human life, unlike other cultures. So the narrative was incredibly corrosive, and one thing I can say 100% sure, since Maidan, since 2014 until now, the reforms, and including in judiciary, in anti-corruption, in building institutions, have been massive. They did not get candidate status because of the war. They got candidate status because the war made the consensus in the EU possible. They got candidate status on the basis of the reform track. I wrote that, I mean, I had a broken knee, so I was in a wheelchair sitting around my dining table with my team when we were drafting the opinion. I would really recommend anybody who would say, oh, they're so corrupt, just read it. The amount of reforms Ukraine has done is remarkable. Is there still a lot to do? Absolutely. Is there still corruption? Absolutely, just like in my own country. But it was not, the war was the proximate cause for the candidate status, not the reason.
Und was macht es der Kandidatenstatus?
English?
Welchen Unterschied macht, what difference does the candidate status make right now? Das ist eine Frage für den Herrn Botschafter. Was hat das Ukraine?
This is for the ambassador, the Ukrainian people. What do they earn on this status? Permit me a few comments, if I may, as to the topic which you've discussed with Ms. Maternova, because it isn't so fair. You speak a lot about Ukraine, but maybe I should have answered the question myself, or I should do so now. Since the start of this round, we have also been discussing that the best even fall into this trap of the Russian narrative. And this discussion we are having now also is an evidence of this. It actually happened like this because we are speaking here about things which are shown in a distorted manner and are not in tune with reality. Your question was candidate status. Well, it's still perceived as kind of a gift, a present. Why do we not speak about the fact that Ukraine since 2014 has been having the association agreement with the EU? Such association agreement indeed was a very effective fact and has helped Ukraine very much to make enormous progress, also in fighting corruption. Yes, and very often the line of reasoning is heard that Russia didn't want that because they saw that Ukraine indeed flourished. Yes, indeed, we are speaking about one of the reasons being exactly this, and my thanks go to all reminding us of this. Maidan, 2004, by the way, that for the very first time was a moment when Europe discovered Ukraine. All of a sudden, Europe saw Maidan, Ukraine, Maidan with European flags, European ideas. Cool, but then a few months later, one just forgot all of this. One asked for reforms with not so much delicacy. No one knew whether such reforms would be possible at all then or not, because let us not forget that the then elites, which were post-Soviet elites, maybe psychologically speaking, were not prepared to make progress in reforms. The first real apparition of Ukraine was in 2014. Maidan again. That was the new generation, a new generation of Ukrainians who evolved in a free society. And that actually was the fear of Putin. Putin's fear was that Ukraine would get stronger and stronger and more democratic, more and more successful. And this is also one of the reasons why Putin has started this war against Ukraine, and it's also a proxy war against European values, because Ukraine had become more and more successful in reforms and in fighting corruption. No one in Ukraine would say we have no problems with corruption. Just tell me any country which would not speak about corruption. Yes, in Austria corruption is also being mentioned a lot nowadays. Yeah, if you say so, I haven't said it. But I mean, all those now finally dealing with Ukraine, why is that so? We speak about narratives. Many Putin-versteher here had never understood Ukraine, really. So until that horrible war erupted, people did not really understand or see or perceive Ukraine. And the Russians told their narrative, and that narrative was clearly anti-Ukrainian, obviously, and here in Austria also one did not know enough, so one believed the Russians, and that was one of the key moments and signals. Let or leave Ukraine aside because they are corrupt. So I thank you for having said it, and let me repeat it because it's so important. If Ukraine were so corrupt as it is presented, quite often it still is presented, then we would not be as successful in this war as we are. And I wish to know people in the world or in Europe to experience such a thing. But you just take an EU member state and how the elites of one of those countries would have behaved, the best country having no corruption, if all of a sudden they had faced such a huge challenge and would permanently have experienced aircraft, tanks, and so many coming into the country from north, from east, and so on. And you first have to secure your defense. Then you have to make sure that against the background of this war, also economy works out. You also have to make sure that logistics and so on works fine, that people are evacuated accordingly. And what has Ukraine shown? Ukraine has shown quality, and this should also be recognized. And the general said it, and you had asked the question. We see corruption exemplified by the Russian military. That is corruption, what they do in the Russian military. So my call is upon all of you. Please just reflect on this question of Ukraine being a corrupt country. This is one of the worst narratives and lies of the Russian propaganda. Once again, we do have the problem, we accept it, so many other countries have it as well, and we have seen our effective means of fighting corruption. Many acts or laws against oligarchs and so on. We have a very active civil society also. We have many reasons to say that Ukraine, in terms of candidate status, actually deserves this decision. It was not a gift, it was not a present. If you have questions, I will always repeat, I will always say so and answer, yes, we do accept all of this, but just to say that that was just a gift, a present because of the war, maybe it has played a certain part in sensitizing people, but on the other hand, it was the EU and Commission and many countries also having understood how much Ukraine had achieved already. And the association agreement reforms, more than 60% of the content of the agreement have been implemented already. We were very good in cooperation with the EU in many areas. In the digital field, we had been working in so many fields and very well. And of course, with every day of progress and success of Ukraine, for Putin it was clear that Ukraine is making more and more progress and is becoming more and more dangerous to him. And that probably for him was the last possibility, because the last defeat of Ukraine was in 2004, the second defeat in 2014, and now probably it's a decisive step for him. Well, dear Ambassador, if we look now from Ukraine to Georgia, Botchorishvili, Georgia also has been promised or announced candidate status, but not yet received it. Then there have been many demonstrations in Georgia, citizens taking to the street and said the government would not have done everything in order to really get the status. How is the situation nowadays in Georgia towards candidate status?
Well, first of all, I would highlight the importance of that decision which was taken in June by Council of European Union. Why it was important for all three of us, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. After the war of after Russian invasion in Georgia in 2008, in 2009, Eastern Partnership policy was launched. And it created very solid ground for all of us to come closer to the European Union, to sign association agreement, achieve visa-free travel with the European Union. But one important thing was missing, and this was perspective to become member of the European Union. And we mentioned how difficult it was to achieve signing association agreement in 2014, and it cost it blood in Ukraine, in Maidan. We already talked about that. So it showed how important that momentum was. But it still was lacking this perspective for all three of us. And then we remember in 2016 referendum in Netherlands, how it was sort of created atmosphere where we could not move forward when it comes full integration into the European Union. Even if we recall Eastern Partnership Summit just in December of last year, again, at that summit, we could not have that clear message and clear perspective for these countries. So taking this into account, of course, June decision was very important for all three of us to have that clear perspective from European Union that Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia will become one day members of the European Union. But what is important now is important to show the action, and it is not just that decision that was taken in June, but we are moving forward. I will not hide disappointment when it comes to Georgian perspective, because if you look at the progress, if you look at the implementation of association agreements, Georgia has been always front runner, and that status was not coming from out of the blue. It was based on the reforms that government was undertaking, and we are quite successful in many directions when it comes to fight against corruption and many other directions. I will not start listing of them right now. If we look at the geopolitical circumstances and challenges, Georgia is also one who is facing and who is very vulnerable in this situation. Maybe we don't have hot war right now in Georgia, but we don't have sustainable peace neither, while we have military presence on our territory. It is very important to, and then creating this differentiated approach when it comes to Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, of course, that was not that was not something that we wanted to see, and you mentioned demonstrations, and yes, that was clear support from Georgian population to European integration, which I would say, because of the work of the government, because of the work we are doing, increased. If we take numbers in 2014, when we signed the association agreement, support to the European Union was 65% in Georgian population. And today, as we speak, it is more than 80%. So it shows how important was what government was doing during this period when it comes to implementation of association agreement. And we all know it is not that easy. It is not that easy to implement European standards, especially when we did not have that clear goal where we are going. We had clear goal, we know where we are going, but we did not have clear perspective. So now with a clear perspective that Georgia, together with Ukraine and Moldova, will become member of the European Union, of course we are focusing on the first recommendations which were given to Georgia, and Ukraine and Moldova as well, because recommendations are for all three countries. We all know that none of us is ready today to become member of the European Union. Importance is willingness of the government to move forward and to implement reforms. And of course, priorities are there, 12 recommendations from European Commission, and we are working hard to show the progress by the end of the year. And then association agreement remains there, which is important to transform the country.
Willingness ist das Stichwort. Frau Cojocaru, Sie sind...
This is the keyword, Mr. Cabo. You represent the Romanian government. You are also represented in ministerial councils in Brussels. The three countries mentioned, also the Western Balkan countries, are highly motivated to want to go in the European Union. Is the EU also motivated to take them up? Has anything changed?
So a couple of things from my part, and I have to say that I enjoyed a lot the discussion this afternoon here in Salzburg, and it's so interesting to find out so diverse opinions to some point, but so congruent opinions to another point in relation with Ukraine, with EU enlargement and so on. I will say first that Russia is continuing to pose a long-term threat to European security. This is crystal clear. EU enlargement in itself is a strategic project of our union, and this is about the future. We talked a lot this afternoon about the past, that Putin did not understand Ukraine, that he did not consider Ukraine as a real country, that we collectively, we did not understand Putin too much, but we have to look to the future. And I have to recall to you, and many of the panelists already did this, that in June, indeed, we witnessed a milestone in the history of the European Union, if you like. In an unprecedented speed, the Union took important decisions in relation with granting the candidacy status for Ukraine and Republic of Moldova and offering Georgia the prospect for European integration. Moreover, this is a political gesture, if you like, very important one, and no matter how we call it, milestone, crucial moment, historic moment, this is in itself a very, very important, if you like, as I said, unprecedented political gesture towards the future of the European Union. Because if you are talking about Ukraine, if you are talking about Republic of Moldova, if you are talking about the countries in the Western Balkans, we are talking about EU, about European Union future as a whole. Moreover, I would like to recall you the visit to Kiev of the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen back in June, and also, if you remember, the visit of the President of Germany, France, Italy, and Romania also in June, and after this, in Kiev, and after this, the Chancellor. Also, we had that positive decision at the level of EU. So I will say also that we need workable policies and a united front towards EU enlargement also. Because also in relation with the enlargement, we have to bring all the actors to the same table and to think, in a unitary manner also in this regard. We need to keep this political momentum. This is absolutely clear, and this is, as I said, about how we see ourselves, not only our partners and our future partners. It's about ourselves. How can we see us moving forward, moving towards a more powerful, a more integrated, towards a stronger Europe? And I think this is absolutely important. We have seen also our leaders gather in Brussels very recently for a summit dedicated to Western Balkans. So this is very high on the agenda, the issue of the Western Balkans and the integration of the countries in that region, which is, for a country like Romania, of a strategic importance also. By the way, next year Romania is going to hold the presidency of a very important format, which is called SEDEM, Southeastern Defense Ministerial Process. This was a very important one for a country like Romania prior to our accession in EU and NATO also, and we would like very much to revitalize this format. We have very ambitious plans. So, at the end of the day, I will say that it's very much related to our future and the Union's future.
Union's future, Frau Davies, aus Sicht einer Historikerin.
Ms. Davies, you're a historian. Do you think the European countries will really be able to use this moment, as Ms. Cojocaru is wishing they will, or hoping they will? Well, I would hope they would. But as a historian, I prefer to talk about the past, because the advantage there is that you know how things worked out. So I do support what has just been said as a citizen, but let me just rephrase the question in order for me to be able to answer it better. And I'd like to take up what the ambassador has said. I'm very grateful that you pointed out the younger generation, because they're an important factor in making sure that Ukraine continue to exist, continue to hold up and win. I think the young generation made a very important contribution to the process that led Ukraine to be a candidate country. I'd like to point out Maxim Botchorishvili. You can see in my T-shirt. He really is a symbol figure of that generation, even though he is an older member of this generation. Throughout his entire life, he has fought for his liberties and rights. And he's a pacifist. He became a prisoner of war, taken by Russia. And coming back to your question, I'm going to talk about us, which I usually don't like to do, but we, the people who live in free democracies, we really can learn something from Ukraine. Freedom and democracy are not self-evident, but you can do something. You shouldn't just say, well, everything is just corrupt, there's nothing we can do. But I myself have never been affected by certain issues, but direct corruption and oligarchy, these are three aspects that usually go hand in hand. And I quite often have been asked as a historian, is that actually true? And I think it's always good to be able to differentiate and to reject Russian narratives. You were talking about how important narratives is, and sometimes I'm a little bit frustrated because we're all busy rejecting Russian narratives, but we're not developing our own narrative. We shouldn't embellish the history of Ukraine, which also has its own dark chapters, but let's look at Ukraine and the 20th century. 2014, the First World War started, and it was the start of a very violent history, which only ended at the beginning of the 50s, when Ukraine was voluntarily integrated in the Soviet Union. Many people fought back then. And the First World War was a war that was experienced in a very different manner in the region than in the West, because the borders were constantly moving. And then in 1917, 1918, the state was founded for the first time, but it ran into trouble because of the violence. And then a civil war broke out with many people who died, pogroms against Jews, then a few years of respite, and then Holodomor. And this is a question I get, a topic that is addressed nowhere near as often. And what Stalin did back then really was something against Ukraine. Was trying to completely kill off, well, Ukrainian intelligence, and then the big terror that ensued, the Second World War. And then in 1991, the Ukraine finally became independent. And then it lived through the same crisis years as Russia. We always think of Russia when we think of the early 90s, but Ukraine was affected just as much. But people in Ukraine didn't choose the path of extremist nationalism. They didn't give up. They started two revolutions. They started the biggest revolution that has ever to take place in Europe. This is really an unbelievable history, and it really inspires hope, despite this terrible genocidal war that we're seeing now. But this really goes to show we owe something to this country. Mr. Mandl? Now, Ukraine has become a candidate country. Now, you always advocate in favor to also integrating the West Balkan states, and the Eurobarometer surveys that have taken place, and according to these, 50% of EU citizens look critically towards a further enlargement. Now, why should we not listen to those 50%? Well, I have the honor and pleasure to represent the Austrian people in the European Parliament, and this means that we always have to exchange information and also inform people. And I think it's really important to look at the overall context. Now, we have the 6 Western Balkan countries, we have the Eastern Partnership that we're talking about today, 3 countries, and we haven't even talked about Belarus today. I'm going to talk about Belarus in just a couple of seconds, but we have also seen Brexit. Northern Ireland is no longer a member of the EU. Now we're seeing this approach in PESCO again, the Permanent Security Cooperation, and we're seeing the situation in Switzerland. I think we have to really listen to people and listen to their fears and concerns. This goes for people inside and outside of the European Union. And then showing leadership also means that you have to take on responsibilities and, of course, provide the necessary answers. You have to answer the questions people have, especially as far as the Western Balkans are concerned, but also have to answer questions about the candidate status of Ukraine. I traveled to Georgia in April together with the Defense Committee of the European Parliament. I traveled to Syria last March. I've really tried to understand what is going on the ground. Now, I've really seen the trace of blood that Putin's Russia has left. Now, I think the strategy the European Union had to enlargement has failed, and the consequences have been dire. And there's a very important actor that we haven't talked about yet today, China. China is trying to gain influence in Europe through the Western Balkans. Turkey has also been trying to do this, and there are other smaller actors and also non-state actors that are trying the very same thing. So this is important. If you look at Norway, the UK, Northern Ireland, Switzerland, and then enlargement countries, and certain of these are candidate countries, we really have to look at all these regions for our future, for our security. Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, and the Western Balkan states really do have a European perspective, but you also have to listen to what the peoples are saying. On the 1st of March, the European Parliament held an extraordinary sitting, and Ursula von der Leyen said that we have to hold out a hand to the other Russia, the Russia after Putin, which will definitely exist, and we really have to be serious when we extend that hand to Russia. We share the same landmass with Russia. We need to seek peace. The European Parliament has passed a resolution which a large majority has stated its great concern, has expressed its great concern about the position Serbia's towards the war. And this means that Serbia has really now basically moved down on the list of candidate countries. But we have to remain in contact. We really have to see things as they are, assess them as they are. We cannot rely on stereotypes. We do see many stereotypes that are present, fake news, especially on social media. This is something we talked about, Ms. Streitreiter. This is something that we saw during the pandemic and now during war, conspiracy theories, hate speech, fake news. And we all consume all of this as if these were the news. And factual information, researched information, but this is not the case. It's not factually researched information, but this is important to our citizens. We really have to talk about things as they are. We really have to look at the different perspectives, and I think this is really important in order to get through these times where people are trying to sow discord by sending out false information. In conclusion, I briefly mentioned Belarus earlier. I'm a member of parliament, so I have to be very critical to what governments are doing. Now the so-called political community has been founded. Very impressive as a project. Summit took place in Prague a few weeks ago. And Emmanuel Macron launched the idea, he's the French president, and launched the idea during the French presidency. But 2 points of criticisms. I think overall this project means that we're moving in the right direction. But 2 points of criticism. First, Belarus is not part of it, of course. You cannot invite the illegitimate Belarusian leader, but Ms. Tishanovskaya, the opposition leader, should have been invited, because then the round around the table would be complete. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey were also represented. So not only members that have a perspective of becoming EU member states were invited, but more than just these countries. All the candidates countries were represented. Other countries that should have candidate status were invited as well, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. So this should not be an alibi for the enlargement that has so far failed. The EU has not managed to unite Europe, and this is something that we now have to do under the pressure. So we should not just let these countries wait in a tactical manner. And of course, the parliaments have to be included in this process. There are very good parliamentary connections between Georgia and the EU. We have to continue talks on this level. We can do this. I'm one out of 705 MEPs, and we can only take decisions if a majority votes in favor. And this parliamentary dimension, these talks on a parliamentary level with Georgia or Ukraine and or the other countries, I think this is really something that can lead to concrete results. This is positive, something we have to continue. Now I'm looking at the time. I don't know if we have another 15 minutes. We were supposed to stop at 5 o'clock initially, but Mr. Landsbergis still seems to be with us. Initially, we thought that he would disconnect after his intervention.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Wasn't expected.
Mrs.
I hope you followed our discussion. I hope you followed our discussion.
Yes, I followed that. I would like to say one or maybe one basic remark as we speak on our national and European future, and there was a question, and will we have or not any common creative state and peace building future, or the confrontation and ruins finally only in our Europe. It's going towards such a possible result with every day's eventual disaster in Ukraine, and Ukraine indeed is part of Europe, and disaster in Ukraine would be disaster for Europe. And maybe we should underline something more specific and urgent. Quite often, maybe too often, I'm getting an impression that various deliberation about situation and future of Ukraine are waged from some comfortable distance. The true vision from the battlefield would be different. We need to achieve understanding that not Ukraine only, but all Europe is now under question of peace or war, building or destruction. Will Ukraine survive this new type genocidal war with ever new sophisticated military, economic, and ecological weaponry used, and also methods how to break our member in spirit, because Ukraine is European member. This way making Ukraine the land of misfortune. Too seldom are we deliberating who is that diabolic player and manager of this misfortune. Not for Ukraine only. Is there an issue that allegedly something happened with Ukraine, and observers do look how she is trying to cope with her problems? What and why it did happen, and what opportunities should be promising, helpful or not helpful, the survival of Ukraine from state cannibalism of Russia. Not observers.
Mr. Landsbergis, thank you very much.
That would be our stand, and our role would be more promising if not observers, but participants. Please try turn in this direction.
Thank you for your words. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you very much. Greetings to Lithuania. Ich habe Ihnen versprochen, es gibt eine Frage.
Well, I promised you a round of questions. Maybe we can accept a further 2 questions from our audience. I think it's a very exciting topic we're talking about today. Mr. Striedinger. Maybe just a few conclusions from you. Now, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has really caused many discussions as far as defense is concerned and as far as our society is concerned. Now, from the perspective of the Austrian army, you've been receiving lots of information. If you were to look into the future, the next few months, Russia has launched a partial mobilizations. What are the scenarios you're thinking about as far as the future is concerned? Well, I briefly said it. We're facing a race with time. Now, if Russia can reclaim further territories quickly with the support of the West before the Russian army can restructure itself, then the Ukrainian forces may be able to reclaim even more territories more quickly than Russia was expecting. We quite often hear that the war will literally freeze, in a manner of speaking, during the winter. Well, we'll see whether that will happen. Now, there are many things we don't know about this war. 2 questions from the audience.
Hello, I'm from the Institute of the Danube region in Central Europe and Institute of the Regions of Europe. I have a question concerning the information war. After all, we are facing now winter, not right now, but soon. And how could we act to have the population on board? Because this conference is wonderful and excellent, but we need the broad effect on the population. And there were all these atrocities, a part of Bucha, a lot of others. There's more and more evidence in Ukraine, I think, about atrocities. So probably one should continue to talk about this much more so that the people understand a part of the war situation, what is going on against the civilian population.
Do you want to address this question?
Maybe to Mrs. Maternova, because it's actually EU issue, and Lukas Mandl, because of EU Parliament. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that, yes, it does take leadership. It does take political leadership for politicians to actually talk about what is happening, and also think tanks, conferences like this. That's why I have spent over the last 7 months an enormous amount of time going to events and spending a lot of time explaining things. And one thing is to address the narratives, and another thing is to explain the atrocities that are happening. And another thing is to actually put together the positive narrative and positive explanation. So let me just try that. First, very much agree that the that the decision in June was about the European perspective. Georgia can catch up. Slovakia lost 2 years in negotiations, so had the shortest negotiation for joining the EU, not 8 but 6 years. So you can catch up. You have the capacity to mobilize. Ukraine. has 5 or 6 reasons why I think it's in our interest to want Ukraine in. First of all, it has shown remarkable resilience and agency. Just one figure speaks for all. Thanks to the Black Sea Initiative and the solidarity lanes of the EU, export is now at pre-war level. And this is unfortunately before the latest rounds of bombings. But export in August and September was at pre-war levels. So that's resilience with a capital R that we all could use. Second, youth was already mentioned, and the strength of the civil society is something that could reinvigorate European public dialogue very much. Third is the digital capacity of the country. Save for Estonia, Ukraine is the most digital country in Europe. I mean, I have a colleague who is hosting a Ukrainian family in Brussels and have a 16-year-old teenager who was amused when he saw an envelope with a bill from the electricity company. Oh, you still get envelopes. Think of Austria, think of Slovakia, think of Germany. I think we all can learn a lot. If it wasn't for the DIA application that everybody carries, half of the public services could not be provided now. Fourth is the breadbasket of Europe. It has the most high quality land. And this was actually, we talked about Hitler here once, the whole Lebensraum was about Ukraine, right? It was subjugation of the Slavic people. First and foremost was Ukraine. So it's a breadbasket that can add to our food security. Raw materials, the rare minerals that are so necessary for the modern economy, plentiful in Ukraine. And I will finish by saying the most performant army in Europe. I don't think there is any question, and especially for Austria, this should be very attractive. So I will just say, yes, let's talk about the atrocities, but let's also put forward the positive narrative and the strategic. You mentioned, Madam, that enlargement is of strategic interest, but it's important to boil it down to concrete things. So I just gave you 5 or 6. Thanks.
Okay. Ich glaube, Sie waren auch angesprochen, kurz Herr Mandl.
Mr. Mandl, you were also asked? Yes, I think this is a very important question, because the sanctions are a way of fighting back against a bloody war, and this is a first in history. I'm sitting next to a historian, but I think I'm right in saying that this is a first in history, and we really have to make an effort, and I would caution against saying we just have to put on a thicker sweater, because I think this is not in line with the reality most people are experiencing. Most people are experiencing tremendously high energy prices. Yesterday I was talking to someone in a football stadium, and this person was telling me that their energy bill had simply exploded. Manufacturing processes are being challenged. Our labor markets are seeing the challenge. Fuel is getting more expensive, and I think one thing is important. There's one thing that we have to say very clearly. This is because of Putin. Putin is to blame for this. Russia is to blame for this. We have to keep our defenses up, and the sanctions do have an effect. I think we have to say this. And I think we really have to state things very clearly, state things in a clear manner, and at the same time we have to respect other opinions. And this is something I can say for myself. I hope that this is something we've all learned during the pandemic. Certain people have opinions that aren't in line with what we know from science, with what we know is reality. But these are opinions that these people who are real people have. This is also to do with their emotions, and we have to respect that. This is important, but when it comes down to the hard facts, we really have to state things very clearly. We shouldn't mince matters when we really should be talking about hard, cold facts. I think these are the challenges that we're facing. I think this is the first time we're facing these types of challenges, and the more we continue to talk to each other, the better.
Verständnis, dass das die zweite und letzte Frage. Aber ich glaube, Sie.
Sorry, this is the second and last question. I'm sorry. Alfred Braus, President of the Ukraine and Austrian Association. It is for the ambassador and Brussels/Strasbourg. We have heard that there are justified hopes that Ukraine could win. That would be nice. Let's hope it happens. But let's think a step further. Ukraine is very weak in economic terms at the moment. 35 to 40% unemployment. The BIP has gone down by 30 to 35%. Infrastructure, and here I'm not just thinking energy, but bridges, roads, houses, and factories that have been bombed, and we know that it will take hundreds of billions of dollars or euros to build up Ukraine again. So my question to the ambassador and to Brussels or Strasbourg is, what do we have to do, or what can we do to help Ukraine at this point? And I hate to think of what might happen after the midterms in the United States if the Trumpists come back to power and less support might be coming from that part of the world. So what can the European Parliament do? What can Western Europe do in order to make sure that support continues going to Ukraine and is not paralyzed all of a sudden, because then things would no longer look so good? Thank you for the question. Ambassador, would you like to start? Yes, thank you. I'll try to answer your question first of what candidate status means and the long road to the European Union. Of course, it's an impulse for us. It spurs us to do more in order to actually achieve our goal. Thank you for your question. Now, the situation is that either Ukraine wins, or can Russia actually achieve its goal? It's not a nice thought, but if Russia does achieve its goal, then it will be absolutely fatal for Europe as well. And I think that people are realizing increasingly that Ukraine has to win the war. And the reason for that are Europe's interests as well. So I understand people's concerns. However, let's be honest to each other. Fatigue, yes. But let's keep our goal in mind. Will the Russians be won over in Ukraine, or will we let them keep on plundering, raping, destroying until they destroy all of Europe? I mean, we have to win this war. Putin has already lost it strategically a couple times, but the fighting is ongoing, nevertheless. And therefore, my appeal is that Ukraine continue to receive military support. And it was said that Ukraine will continue to have to lead offensive. Yes, we will. But if we are to lead offensive, we need tanks and other military equipment so that we can be successful. We can't just send our people, our soldiers, to defend territory without the necessary equipment. So military support is necessary. On the other hand, we need everything that can be done in order to protect our people. So we need air defense systems which can protect and save human lives, and which can also protect critical infrastructure. Because, of course, it's about Ukraine, but we continue to send power to Europe. If I can just interrupt you, Actually, this was a specific question which had to do with financial reconstruction. Well, that would be a success story for the entire Western free democratic community. And this also has to do with our EU membership. We're working for that as well. We want European framework conditions to be set up which correspond to European standards. And this too will be the interest of Europe. Austrian companies will be involved as well, and they can make lots of money. And this, however, will also have to be financed by Russian money because Russia, of course, is the perpetrator country here. So it's not just about Europe, the European Bank and so forth, or the World Bank financing this reconstruction. It has to be Russia as well. So that was something which was mentioned very briefly, but nevertheless, we need to keep it in mind. Negotiations are necessary, and they can only be about Russia withdrawing from Ukrainian territory. Russia has to be the one defending itself because it is guilty. But reconstruction has to be a success story and it has to be a signal to Russia and Belarus, perhaps as well, about the attractiveness of the free world. And I think we can do that. I think we can be successful, and we need to talk about it more. One more thing about the Brussels perspective.
Yes, but before we get to the big reconstruction, you need to win the war. And in order to win the war, you need arms and you need money. It's about $1.5 billion. It's actually $1.5 billion that the US government is giving to Ukraine this year. And as President von der Leyen mentioned at her press conference after the last summit 2 days ago, we are preparing a structural solution to do something similar because Ukraine needs $3 to $4 billion on a monthly basis just to survive, just to provide public services, keep the trains running. And there is going to be a conference the day after tomorrow in Berlin discussing just that.
Danke vielmals. Viele Fragen wären noch, aber ich danke Ihnen vielmals für den Einblick. Wir konnten einige.
Thank you very much. There's still lots of questions, but we'll have to conclude now. And thank you very much for your availability. Maka Botchorishvili chairs the EU Integration Committee in the Parliament of Georgia. Katarina Maternova, Deputy Director General of DG NEAR European Commission. Thank you very much for coming. Simona Cojocaru, Secretary of State for Security Policy and International Relations in Romania. Ludwig, Chief of Staff of the Austrian Armed Forces. Franziska Davies, of course, a historian from the Munich University, and Lukas Mandl, member of the European Parliament for Austria. Thank you very, very much for your attention.